Hello, hello, hello. So, I'm Heidi at Soundberry Borough, and I've had some requests to share how I make my sourdough bread for $1.22 approximately Canadian for a batch. And so, we did the first part earlier. You'll be able to see the first part. This is part 2. And all we did the first part was to get the sourdough starter ready. And so in here I have somewhere between 1 and 2 cups of sourdough starter. I don't measure it out exactly. This is what it looks like now. So it looks a lot more fluffy and full than it looked before. So what we're going to need for this in total are 3 cups of warm water, 6 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons, excuse me, I'm going to repeat that so it's clear, 2 teaspoons of salt, and I do use a 1/4 teaspoon of Fleischmann's traditional active dry yeast. And it's just a little bit. It just gives, it just makes sure that your bread has a little bit of an extra boost. And you don't have to use it, but we keep our kitchen pretty cold, so it's a little warmer than it was when I did the first video. It's 68 degrees now, and the time now is 9:08 p.m. if you're looking for some kind of time stamps or times to follow. The next step will be tomorrow morning when I get up pretty early. So I'm going to show you the float test, and I hope it passes. So I've got to get some water, some warm water. Oh, come on, warm water. So I'm just going to talk about the float test for a second. The float test is when you take a little bit of sourdough starter and you drop it in the water, the warm water, and see if it floats. Now, this is not floating yet. Looks like it might. There it goes. It's floating now. And so that generally means that your sourdough starter is ready to go. If it doesn't float with this recipe, because you're adding 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, it should still work. And if you're concerned it's not floating, add a little bit more of the yeast, go up to 1/2 teaspoon. And it should be good. So we're going to put our first 2 cups of warm water, and tap water is okay for this section, right in there, with our 1 to 2 cups somewhere in there of sourdough starter. And I'm going to mix it up. So this is pretty familiar, pretty much the same as what we started with earlier, by mixing the water and the previous sourdough starter. And you see it's still nice and bubbly and foamy and a nice brown color. So now I'm going to add the active dry yeast, and I just add about like that much, a 1/4 teaspoon, so it doesn't really affect the flavor. You don't taste this in the bread. And we're going to mix this in. If you've done other bread baking with yeast, you might at this point stop and let the yeast work for 5 minutes or so, but we're not going to do that with this. It's going to be working all night. Next up in our bread bowl is 3 cups of all-purpose flour. So for the sourdough starter, I use rye flour, but for this, for the actual bread, now I use all-purpose flour. 1, 2, 3. And then we just stir that in, just to get everything, moistened. With this step, you don't have to get your hands really involved too much at all. And you don't have to spend a lot of time. You don't have to knead this bread at all. The next thing we will do is put 1 more cup of warm tap water in. So that's 1 more cup, and that's all the water we'll be using. Let me mix that in. Just like that. Look at how bubbly it's getting. When your bread dough is bubbling like that, that's a really good sign. That means the yeast is eating, and that's perfect. And there's so much food in there now. What we're going to do is we're going to add some salt. And salt, I learned many years ago, helps the yeast to stop eating, so they don't eat quite so much. And I've heard that any bread without salt is kind of funky. So for this one we use 2 teaspoons of salt, and you can use sea salt, you can use Himalayan pink salt, you can use iodized salt. We have garlic salt over there. I don't know if I'd use that. If you wanted to have like a garlicky kind of bread, maybe you could try it if you want to play. But I've never done that, and I don't know how that would be. Maybe I'll try it someday. So, I don't know. If you want me to try it, just leave a comment down below and say, hey, give that a try, and maybe we'll try it. See if that's good. So we're adding the last that we're going to be adding to this bread, and that is 3 more cups of all-purpose flour. 2, 3. So in here there are in total 6 cups of all-purpose flour, 3 cups of warm tap water, 2 teaspoons of salt, 1/4 teaspoon of instant yeast, and 1 to 2 cups of sourdough starter. And then we just mix this in. Just to get everything, you don't want like dry spots, you want a nice evenly wet kind of dough. And there we go, and that's it. So like earlier, I'm going to wet my hand to take this excess dough off without it sticking to my fingers too much. Get off of there. Okay. And so this is, at this stage, this is the amount of dishes that we have to do for this stage of the bread. And it is now 9:17. I'm going to re-wet my towel. Just put that over. And then we just leave that till tomorrow morning. And there we go. That's step number 2. Pretty easy. Didn't even really have to get dirty hands.